I'm a little bit scared because when initially it was 10 minutes, then I received the instruction 8 minutes, and now it's 7 minutes, and I'm really, really nervous. Because I could either chop my slides or try to talk really, really fast. So I'm opting for the second option, and hopefully the mic will not switch off. So my name is Koumal. I work for Philip Morris International in External Affairs. My presentation will examine, as the title suggests, the relationship between the sales of smoked and smoke-free tobacco products in several European countries, Japan and Korea. Smoked products mean primarily cigarettes, unless stated otherwise. Smoke-free products refer to heated tobacco units, which are the consumables for heated tobacco products. For all the countries listed on the slide except Norway and Sweden, where we looked at the relationship between cigarette sales and snus. Now, this analysis is preliminary, but it is a necessary first step before we can conduct more sophisticated analysis that can try to address various confounding and other factors that we encounter when analyzing sales data. Now, we know that several studies have provided quite a strong proof that e-cigarettes, electronic cigarettes, serve as a general substitute for cigarettes. Now, this is very important when we look at the regulation and taxation of tobacco and nicotine products, because policies for smoke-free products, such as e-cigarettes, heated tobacco, nicotine pouches, or snus, must be assessed in the context of their impact on the demand for more harmful smoked tobacco products. Now, the present work focuses on smoke-free products other than e-cigarettes. So what we did, we looked at smoked and smoke-free product sales in countries where these products have reached 15% or more of the estimated tobacco sales in 2022, based on PMI's investor disclosures. So this is all publicly available data. The sales data that we used are available in Section 7 of PMI's investor information and include annual sales volumes estimates for cigarettes, other combustible tobacco products, heated tobacco products for 30 countries between 2013 and 2022. They also include snus sales estimates for Sweden and Norway. Now, the link to the investor communication presentation where this data is contained is on the slide. Before estimating correlation, all sales volumes were converted into a hypothetical cigarette equivalents using the conversions that you can see on the slide. Now let's go to the results. The strongest negative correlation between cigarette and smoke-free tobacco product sales was found in Japan, indicating that as cigarette sales decrease, smoke-free product sales increase. Another example is Sweden, where we looked at the relationship between the sales of cigarettes and snus. We also found a strong negative correlation between these two product categories. In fact, we found very similar results across all the countries we looked at, which you can see on the slide. So we saw strong negative correlation between smoke-free and smoked products, regardless of whether we used only cigarettes or all smoked tobacco products as a comparator. Now, these were annual sales. We also looked at correlations using sales data that were collected more frequently, such as monthly or quarterly. This is the example from Korea. The data, again, is publicly available and published by the Korean Ministry of Finance. Now, when using more frequent data without any adjustments for fluctuations, the correlations were less strong, which might be due to seasonality in cigarette sales, which are the highest typically during the summer months. We don't observe the same patterns of seasonality with smoke-free products. These fluctuations can mask correlation effects, and we will need to account for them in future studies. Now, seasonality, though, is not the only issue we need to take into account when looking at sales volumes. Here are a few other considerations. First one is failure to capture all tobacco product sales. So the most precise estimates that we have for sales volumes are for cigarettes, but even cigarette sales are just estimates. To illustrate this point, the European Commission tried to quantify the size of the cigarette market in the EU in 2020, and they produced estimates that varied between 408 billion cigarettes sold in 2020 in the EU and 436 billion cigarettes. So that's a difference of almost 30 billion cigarettes. Now, for context, in Greece, there were around 11 billion cigarettes sold last year, and there are only 5 countries in the EU where cigarette sales exceeded 30 billion units in 2022. The second one is the impact of travel, tourism, cross-border, and duty-free purchases. We will show that on the next slide on the example of Norway. I will also cover the impact of illicit trade on a separate slide. Now, sales data may be impacted also by changes in population size and composition, not just sudden changes like, for example, the inflow of refugees from Ukraine, but even more longer-term trends, where in many European countries the population increases are driven by immigration from the countries where smoking prevalence tends to be higher. The next point, consumption patterns, I'll illustrate just one example from our clinical studies. We saw that smokers who were randomized to IQOS, which is a heated tobacco product, typically, when they were randomized to IQOS, their stick consumption, the unit consumption of heated tobacco units went up, and their nicotine uptake went down compared to baseline. But over time, their stick consumption was reduced to around the baseline, while their nicotine uptake increased to around the baseline, which reflects the adaptation period. So these products are not used exactly the same as cigarettes, and of course some adaptation is needed, and we will see fluctuations in the consumption over time. Finally, when we want to sum up the market size, we need to convert, ideally, it is helpful to establish a common denominator. Since cigarettes is the most predominant tobacco product category in most countries, we would use cigarette equivalents. But that can be a little bit challenging for products that are not cigarettes, as you can imagine. So I don't know what is the cigarette equivalent of a nicotine pouch or a disposable e-cigarette. Now, let's look at Norway. So the travel and cross-border restrictions. So on the left-hand side, we plotted the sales volumes of cigarette and snus in Norway, excluding the years 2020 and 2021, which was the pandemic. On the right-hand side, all sales are included for all the years. As you can see, there's a large spike in domestic sales of both product categories, snus and cigarettes, in both years, most likely due to travel restrictions during COVID-19 pandemic. This chart also shows that domestic tobacco consumption in Norway in normal years, i.e. when there is not a pandemic, are clearly not reflective of actual consumption. As a result, the correlations are obviously vastly different. Now, this is not, we don't see that only in sales volumes, but this is a chart from the Norwegian Institute of Public Health, which shows the results of a survey asking respondents about the source of their cigarette consumption. Where did you buy the product you are using currently? It appears that less than 60% of cigarettes consumed in Norway had been purchased in Norway prior to the pandemic and after the pandemic, with around 20% of products being purchased in Sweden. Naturally, this situation affects legal sales not only in Norway, but also in Sweden and other countries. The data for snus is actually very similar, so this is just one example for cigarettes. In terms of illicit trade, this also obviously impacts domestic sales, and France, which is the country with the highest amount of illicit trade in Europe, almost 1/3 of cigarettes consumed in France are estimated to come from illicit sources, i.e. these sales are not captured in the domestic duty-paid sales volume estimates. Some of the countries with a high share of heated tobacco products that were included in our analysis also have a high share of illicit trade, for example, Greece and Lithuania. But illicit trade is prevalent everywhere. Let me take France to illustrate the issue of illicit trade. If we were to use legal domestic sales as a proxy for the success of tobacco control measures or as a proof of substitution with smoke-free products, we would see a success story. Cigarette sales are declining quite rapidly, as you can see on this chart. However, this would be far from the truth because legal consumption has just been replaced by illicit cigarettes, and smoking prevalence in France has actually remained virtually flat for the past 10 years. Finally, we did one more exercise for this presentation by pooling the EU countries with a high share of heated tobacco products and examining whether the evolution of cigarette sales in those countries differs from the remaining EU countries. We selected the year 2019 as the cutoff point because that is when heated tobacco products were available in all eight countries, where their share reached 15% in 2022. Despite the limitations of this analysis, the sales of cigarettes were decreasing faster in those 8 countries than in the rest of the EU. This data does not show causality, that cigarette sales were dropping faster because of the presence of heated tobacco products, but they certainly signal that we need to examine these trends with more granularity, including whether there are any other strong determinants of cigarette sales that could explain this difference. In conclusion, we detected indications that heated tobacco products and snus are competing against cigarettes. By definition, correlation analysis cannot demonstrate whether the changes in the sales of one product category directly led to the changes in the sales of another category. Future research needs to account for the confounding factors I mentioned previously. I think the factors such as cross-border sales and illicit trade will be the most challenging to adjust for due to the difficulty in quantifying their magnitude. But the European examples also show that sales volumes do not necessarily equal consumption volume or prevalence. We also need longitudinal product use studies to understand product use trajectories and better prevalence studies with sufficient frequency and representativeness that accurately differentiate the use of different product categories, because ultimately health outcomes depend on consumption patterns. Finally, the fact that smoke-free products are competing against smoked tobacco products should be the central consideration when designing regulatory and fiscal policies aimed at reducing smoking. And I don't see the timer, but did I make it? No?
Did you take the 10 minutes after all?
Oh, I'm sorry.